Under a cloudless spring sky, the sprawling Whitmore estate gleamed like a scene straight from a high society magazine spread. Located just outside Charleston, South Carolina, the 10,000-square-foot mansion stood proudly on a hill, surrounded by carefully manicured gardens that stretched across 5 acres of private land. It was the kind of place where every blade of grass seemed trimmed with precision, and every rosebush bloomed on cue. Today, the estate had been transformed into the setting of what many were already calling the wedding of the year. White roses and peonies adorned the cobblestone pathways, while custom-built arches wrapped in silk ribbons framed each entrance. Towering oak trees draped in twinkling string lights created a canopy of elegance over the outdoor ceremony area. Suspended from their branches were imported crystal chandeliers, each one glittering under the golden afternoon sunlight. The scent of fresh florals mingled with the light aroma of champagne, wafting through the warm April breeze. Guests arrived in sleek black town cars and chauffeur-driven limousines, stepping out in couture gowns and bespoke suits. Servers in perfectly pressed uniforms floated between the crowd, offering flutes of Dom Pérignon and delicate hors d'oeuvres served on trays of polished silver. Conversations swirled around European art auctions, hedge fund performances, and last month's trip to the French Riviera. The event pulsed with the unspoken language of old money and generational wealth. At the center of it all stood Charlotte Whitmore, the radiant bride, daughter of Richard and Victoria Whitmore, a family whose name had long been synonymous with influence in East Coast financial circles. Her soon-to-be husband, Darius Blake, was equally impressive, a rising tech entrepreneur who had made his fortune before his 35th birthday and was widely admired for his intellect, poise, and humility. On the surface, it was a celebration of love and legacy, an immaculate union between elegance and enterprise. But beneath the shimmer of diamonds and the rustle of designer fabric, not everything was as perfect as it appeared. The air was charged, not just with excitement, but with unspoken tensions. And as the festivities unfolded, the carefully constructed image of perfection would soon face a truth far deeper than wealth could ever hide. As the ceremony approached, a sleek black sedan pulled up along the gravel driveway, its polished exterior reflecting the late afternoon sun. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door with care. From the back seat emerged Evelyn Carter. She moved slowly but with unmistakable grace. Her silver curls, styled neatly, framed a face marked with time but glowing with quiet strength. Dressed in a modest navy tulle dress with pearl accents, Evelyn looked entirely appropriate for the occasion, refined, elegant, and composed. She held a small clutch in one hand and rested her other lightly on the arm of her grandson, Darius Blake, who had personally come to escort her. To Evelyn, this was more than just a wedding. It was a moment she had long awaited, to witness her beloved grandson marry the woman he loved. Her eyes scanned the garden with warmth, taking in the scene, the laughter, the sparkle of crystal chandeliers overhead, but almost instantly she felt it, that subtle shift in the air. The looks, the whispers. Victoria Whitmore, mother of the bride, stood near the main reception tent holding a glass of red wine. Her eyes landed on Evelyn with barely concealed distaste. She leaned toward a nearby relative and muttered just loud enough for others to hear, "Some people clearly don't know the difference between evening attire and Sunday church clothes." A few forced chuckles followed. Evelyn heard it, but she didn't flinch. Richard Whitmore, Charlotte's father, offered nothing more than a dismissive nod, as if Evelyn were a mere acquaintance, not the matriarch of the groom's family. No handshake. No greeting. The rest of the Whitmore relatives followed suit, exchanging polite smiles laced with judgment, subtly shifting their conversations when Evelyn came near. When Evelyn took her seat at a round table near the rear of the tent, guests subtly inched their chairs away. Attempts at light conversation were met with clipped replies or awkward silences. Even when she reached for a simple hors d'oeuvre from a passing tray, Victoria's expression soured, as though Evelyn had reached for something she didn't deserve. Darius noticed it all. His jaw tightened. But Evelyn placed a calm hand on his arm and said gently, "It's all right, dear. Some lessons take time." Despite the cold shoulders and veiled insults, Evelyn remained composed. Her smile was gentle, her presence grounded. She had lived through decades of far worse discrimination. That had once been loud and violent was now dressed in pearls and politeness. Yet she knew exactly what it was, and she met it, not with confrontation, but with character. To the Whitmores she was just an elderly black woman in a navy dress, someone easily overlooked. What they didn't know, what they hadn't bothered to ask, was who she truly was. The quiet woman they dismissed was a storm of legacy, resilience, and unshakable dignity. And before the night was over, every single person who had looked down on Evelyn Carter would come to understand exactly how wrong they had been. The reception had reached its crescendo. String lights twinkled above like stardust, and the soft melodies of a live quartet danced through the air. Crystal flutes clinked in toasts, laughter flowed as freely as the champagne, and the Whitmores glided through the crowd with curated charm, basking in their social prestige. Evelyn Carter sat at a corner table, quietly observing, untouched by the glitz and pretense around her. She sipped her tea slowly, her back straight, her presence calm. To most of Charlotte's family, she remained an afterthought, a polite obligation from the Groom side. Their attention stayed fixed on the prominent guests, a senator's wife, a hedge fund titan, a tech mogul visiting from San Francisco. Then, the music paused. The event coordinator, dressed in sleek black, stepped onto the small platform near the dance floor and tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and confident, "we are honored tonight by the presence of a very special guest, an individual whose contributions to industry, philanthropy, and social equity have left a lasting mark on this country. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest of honor." The crowd buzzed with anticipation. Charlotte's parents, Victoria and Richard Whitmore, straightened in their seats. Their daughter's wedding had already made headlines. This could make the society pages. A tall, silver-haired gentleman in a tailored navy suit rose from a table near the bar. His movements were deliberate, confident, and calm. People turned. A few whispered. Someone gasped. "Is that William Carter?" Indeed it was. William Carter, the billionaire investor, founder of Carter Global, a man whose name was etched into university buildings and hospital wings across America. He was known not only for his empire but for his integrity, his humility, and his refusal to play by the rules of elitism. But instead of stepping onto the stage, William turned. He walked directly toward Evelyn. The crowd hushed. A wave of confusion, then astonishment swept through the guests. William stopped in front of her table and, with reverence, bowed his head. "Madam Carter," he said warmly, "it's been too long." A collective gasp rippled through the garden. Evelyn looked up with a soft smile. "Ah, William," she replied, her voice poised and knowing, "you haven't changed a bit." The Whitmores sat frozen. William turned to the stunned crowd. "Many of you know me as a businessman, but none of what I've built would have been possible without the woman sitting before you. Evelyn Carter is one of the greatest minds of our generation. She built an empire from nothing, mentored leaders, and funded scholarships for thousands of students, many of whom now sit in rooms just like this one." A silence unlike any before took hold. Guests, who had overlooked her, now leaned forward. Guilt etched itself onto faces that had smirked or sneered earlier. Even the most powerful in the crowd seemed smaller under the weight of realization. Richard Montgomery swallowed hard. Victoria's wineglass trembled. And Evelyn? She simply smiled and nodded once, graceful, composed, unbothered. Because she didn't need to demand respect, she commanded it without ever raising her voice. The music resumed softly in the background, but something had shifted. The energy of the evening no longer pulsed with arrogance or celebration. It now thrummed with reflection and discomfort. Guests still mingled, but their conversations were muted. The once vibrant laughter that had echoed through the garden was now replaced by hushed murmurs and sidelong glances toward the woman in the navy blue dress who had, without fanfare, stolen the entire night. Victoria and Richard Whitmore sat stiffly at their table, their postures still proud but their expressions hollow. The social armor they had worn so effortlessly all evening had cracked under the weight of truth. Their earlier smirks had vanished. replaced by tight lips and fidgeting hands. No longer the most admired figures in the room, they now sat exposed, not because of what Evelyn had said, but because of what she had not said. Her refusal to gloat, her refusal to even raise her voice, had made their humiliation all the more profound. All around them, the tide had turned. Influential guests, once circling the Whitmores like satellites, now gravitated toward Evelyn. She remained seated, sipping her tea, speaking kindly to those who approached. She did not mention the disrespect she had endured. She didn't need to. Her presence alone, poised, powerful, and quiet, spoke louder than any rebuke ever could. Victoria's eyes lingered on her, a tight knot of shame twisting in her chest. She thought back to the snide comment she'd made earlier about Evelyn's attire, the sneer in her voice, the cheap laughs she'd earned. It now echoed in her mind like an accusation. She glanced around and noticed how others were watching her, not with admiration, but with quiet judgment. For the first time in years, Victoria felt small. Richard, meanwhile, sat staring into the distance, processing the damage. His entire career had been built on perception, on aligning himself with power, on recognizing influence before anyone else. Yet the most powerful person at his daughter's wedding had been sitting 20 feet from him the entire time, and he had treated her like an afterthought. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was shaken. And worse, he knew it would follow him. Charlotte Whitmore, the bride, stood beside Darius, her hands still intertwined with his. She had spent the evening pulled between two worlds, one built on status and legacy, the other rooted in character and truth. And now, as she watched her family shrink into themselves while Evelyn rose in quiet grace, the choice was clear. She turned to Darius, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I let them say those things. I let them act that way." Darius looked at her for a long moment, then nodded gently. "What matters now is what we build from this." Charlotte's eyes found Evelyn, who met her gaze with the soft smile of someone who had seen generations come and go, and who still believed people could change. Charlotte took a breath and whispered, "I won't let ignorance define our future. Not in our home, not in our children." Evelyn nodded. "That's a good start, dear. Change begins quietly, then it echoes." And as the evening wore on, the Whitmores sat in the fading glow of their own reflection, finally beginning to understand what legacy truly meant. As twilight settled over the Whitmore estate, the glow of string lights shimmered like distant stars, casting long, soft shadows across the manicured lawn. The music played on, and guests returned to their conversations, though none with quite the same ease as before. Something had changed, not just in the atmosphere but in the hearts of those who had witnessed what unfolded. Evelyn Carter hadn't made a scene. She hadn't raised her voice or demanded apologies. She hadn't needed to. Her silence, her grace, her quiet refusal to be diminished, that was her power, and in the end it spoke louder than any title or speech ever could. She had entered the wedding as an overlooked guest. She left it as the person everyone wanted to speak to, not because she flaunted her success, but because she embodied something even rarer in a world built on pretense: authenticity. Where others had used wealth to construct barriers, Evelyn had used her life to build bridges. Her legacy wasn't written in contracts or country clubs, but in scholarships awarded, lives uplifted, and dignity maintained when no one was watching. The Whitmores had spent their lives defining worth by social capital, expensive last names, and curated circles. But that night, they were forced to confront a different truth. Class is not about how much you own. It's about how you treat others. Their curated image of superiority crumbled beneath the weight of their own arrogance, and for the first time in a very long time, they were left to face who they had become when no one was praising them. Charlotte, now a newlywed, felt this truth more deeply than anyone. Standing beside Darius, watching her parents in their uncomfortable silence, she realized something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Tradition only holds value when it aligns with principle, and a family legacy means nothing if it's built on exclusion. She had once idolized the grandeur of her family's name. Tonight she admired the quiet courage of the woman who had been mocked yet never wavered. And from that admiration came a promise that the life she and Darius would build together would not be rooted in image, but in integrity. Nearby, Evelyn sat peacefully at her table, now surrounded by guests eager to shake her hand, to hear her story, to learn from her. But she remained as she had always been, modest, composed, with a warmth that disarmed and a presence that commanded. She didn't need this moment to validate her. She had already lived a life that mattered. And as the final dance began and the night drew to a close, it became clear to everyone present, this wedding would not be remembered for the roses or the chandeliers, not for the guest list or the designer gowns, but for the day a quiet woman reminded an entire room what true worth really looked like. Because in a world obsessed with status, it is dignity and humility that stand the test of time. This story reminds us that dignity and humility are not weaknesses, they are profound strengths. Evelyn Carter never raised her voice, never demanded recognition, and yet she taught everyone in the room the most powerful lesson of all: how we treat others, especially when we think no one is watching, reveals the truth of our character. In a world increasingly driven by appearances, wealth, and status, it's easy to forget the value of kindness, respect, and grace. But those are the qualities that endure. For many older adults who have lived through decades of change, this story echoes a timeless truth. Real influence doesn't come from titles or money, but from the lives we touch and the example we set. Evelyn's quiet presence disrupted a room full of arrogance without a single harsh word. She didn't need to prove herself, her life spoke for her. And that's a powerful reminder for us all. Our legacy is not in what we own, but in how we live. Whether we're grandparents, mentors, neighbors, or friends, we carry within us the ability to uplift or to overlook. And it's never too late to choose the better path, to lead with grace, to listen before judging, and to remember that respect is something we give, not because someone earns it, but because everyone deserves it. True class, after all, isn't worn on the outside, it's lived from the inside.